That's good.
Okay, so I know it's been a while. It's been 2 weeks. I hope everyone had a good break. And we are now back to work dealing with Shirley Guthrie's book, Christian Doctrine. And the section we are talking about is we're in part 2, God and Human Beings, and what does God want with us? And it's the doctrine of predestination, right? This is the one when you meet people at parties or out in public and they find out you're Presbyterian. Tell me what is this predestination you people believe in? That seems to be the sticking point. I often wonder what the other denominations' sticking points are, but this one is ours, and it's really a sticky one, and it's kind of like, can't you ask me like an easy one, like?
Trinity.
Well, yeah. Can we talk about the Trinity for 5 minutes? That's not so easy.
That's not
either.
an easy one either.
That's not so much of an easy one either.
But everybody has it, though.
But everybody has it.
Exactly.
Right. Every Christian denomination's got to tangle with that one, but predestination is definitely
I don't think the Unitarians believe in the Trinity.
Trinity. Yeah, and in some of the
Unitarianism.
I don't know. I don't actually know what Unitarians believe, and we're going to talk about universalism in a second.
I mean, that's part of their belief is
Everybody is saved.
right.
Yeah, well, universalism, right?
Well, I mean, but the Unitarian used to be called Unitarian Universalism. I
Yes,
think.
Yeah.
and then they've kind of moved away from,
Oh, they have.
or have they?
I know
I'm not
that-
sure.
I mean, from what I understand, they're like Satanists who go to the Universalist Church. I mean,
I'm not.
that they have no like.
Well, I
you
think
have to
they
believe
kind of,
this, that, and
yeah.
the other thing. I mean,
They should
their
invite them
pastor's a
sometime.
Christian. Assuming it's still Bill Breeden.
It'd be
Invite
an
them
interesting
to talk
discussion.
Tuesday, yeah.
I really don't know. I don't know what exactly they believe.
Well, somebody tried to get me to go to it back before I returned to Christianity, and that was the impression that she gave, was like there are no stipulations on your beliefs at all. Just
Yeah,
Yeah,
show up.
yeah.
yeah.
Me
I
being
went
OCD, that's
to a
kinda
Unitarian
hard.
church when I was
Right.
in college.
Well, and
That
that's
was,
why it didn't
a few
appeal to me.
decades
I'm
ago.
like,
Yeah.
if you don't stand
I
for
like
something,
some
you'll
kind of
fall for
structure.
anything kind of thing.
I need some kind of structure. Just, which is amazing, since I went to like a Montessori preschool for like 2 years. You would think that I'd be more of a freewheeling Bob
Been
Dylan type, but I'm not.
Rebelling against it.
I guess I'm not. I like the humanitarian roots, but when it comes to other things, I really like to have structure. Ask my wife. All my DVDs are in order, alphabetically, and then numerically in the front. Oh, it's horrible.
Yeah, don't tell my wife.
No.
Oh yeah. So, but you know what? I've talked to people. and They say a little bit of OCD is very helpful.
I think so.
I think so too.
I have OCD.
Yeah, I do too.
We probably all have a little bit of it.
I don't know. There's some people I wonder. I'm like, you could use a little OCD.
Right.
All right. So we ended, and well, I'm just going to do like a very brief. I'm not going to go into anything, but we'll talk briefly about the chapters, sections we just passed. We talked a little bit about double predestination, right? That and what does double predestination teach? Well, predestination,
I
if
think
it's
I missed this week.
if predestination teaches that some are predestined to be saved,
The others is some predestined.
some are predestined to go the other direction.
Yeah.
All right, and so we looked at some scriptures that supported that, and then we looked at some scriptures that did not support that. And if you want to look at that, at your own time, we have those down here. And Guthrie ended that section by saying, can some be automatically rejected? Is that the Christian answer? And so that's how Guthrie ends that section. Can that work, or does that work from the scriptures? So Guthrie then moves to universalism. And I'm going to read a small piece, which is on page 124 of his book. One alternative to double predestination is the view that God loves and is gracious towards all people, chooses all, rejects none, everyone is included, no one is excluded. Even if some are alone and apart and cannot find rest in this life, they are destined ultimately to live in joy and peace with God, with fellow human beings, and with themselves. Salvation is universal. So Guthrie is now going to bring out some arguments like we did in the last section. He'll bring out some arguments for universalism, and then he will be bringing out some arguments against universalism. So for universalism, one, the Bible at places does not say, the Bible at places does say that God's grace is for all, right? And we do know that. It does say that. It emphasizes the sovereign power of God over sin. Salvation by grace alone and not by free will. So this one's more, to me, more of a theological look at that. So saying that because salvation is by grace and not by our works, well, does it make a difference what we do? And then for the ultimate, it is the ultimate good news. Well, it would be the ultimate good news, especially if you look at some characters who have lived throughout recorded history. You know, you can go from small issues and say, well, that person just didn't like God or didn't believe in God, to people like Pol Pot or Hitler or
It's funny, that was the
Stalin.
first name that came into my mind too.
What's that?
Pol Pot.
Pol Pot. Yeah, I mean, you think
Hitler's
about.
played out, he's just been overused.
Well, we overuse.
Pol Pot's the new Hitler.
I mean, that's right. Pol Pot. I mean, and Stalin.
Yeah.
I mean, more people than Hitler.
Mao.
I mean,
Mao.
Mao. I mean, you look at some of these individuals, and some are theorists, right? Some just write books, and some actually do some hard things. Some are very peaceable atheists, right? Don't harm anything. And some people who claim to be religious, like Hitler, killed oodles of people, right? And so, you know, it's not to say, you know, well, these are just, no, they're not just atheists or they're not just religious people. These are people who, you know, people who do some horrible things. So those are Guthrie's arguments for universalism. And it would be ultimate good news for everybody, no doubt. So Guthrie also lays out some arguments against universalism. One, what about the text that warned that rebellion against God and its consequences? And there are lots of them. It's kind of hard to gloss over those. When even Jesus talks about them, right? It's
Right.
not just, you know, well, that's an old way of looking at things. Well, you know, Jesus talked about those things too. You know, and Jesus was not all doom and gloom. I'm not saying that. But Jesus did talk about these things, right? Two, double predestination might have a problem with God's unqualified love. But universalism has a problem with God's what? Justice. And remember the previous chapter when we talked about God, right? And how sometimes people will pigeonhole God on either side. God is all just. Well, what about love? And some people will say, well, God is all love. Okay, well, yes, God is love, but what about justice? Right? Remember we talked and Guthrie...
Tough love.
Right. Guthrie brings out the point that you cannot have one without the other. You must talk about God's justice when you talk about God's love, and you must talk about God's love when you talk about God's justice, right? So to say that God's unqualified love, well, yes, well, what about God's justice? There is none. Right? There is none when you look at it that way. And then the final piece Guthrie brings out is a relationship with God is a two-way street. Yeah, right? It's not just that God is loving and just, but, you know, the humanity must reciprocate. I mean, we must respond back. Or else what's the sense of there being a God at all? Or, you know, consequences, or, you know, why behave at all? You know, if that was the case. So that's, you know, in this section he's talking about different ideas and different ways to look at things. All right, so that's universalism. Then we move into Pelagianism. And Pelagius was a person who lived, and Pelagius had some interesting ways of looking at things when it came to salvation. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that in our section next. And I'm going to read you a piece from Guthrie on page 126 of his book. If double predestination says that God chooses some and rejects others, and universalism says that God chooses all and rejects no one, this third view says that what happens to us depends on whether we choose or reject God. It is called Pelagianism, because it was first formulated by a British monk named Pelagius. Go figure. See, back then if you invented something, your name gets tied to it.
I'm just surprised it's British. I figured that was Greek or Roman or something.
Well, yeah. Well, it says, he could have been a Latin with a name like Pelagius.
That's what I'm.
Yeah.
So maybe he was.
Yeah. I mean, the Romans were in the British Isle. I'm trying to think when they withdrew. Mid-4s? AD? I mean, so their influence.
Maybe he just took that name. Like some people, when they couldn't get in the orders, they changed their name. They have a religious name, maybe.
That's a good question. And the Roman influence in Britain, see what year that was. Because if you tell me the year, I could tell you where it probably
when they
lands.
left, or when they...
No, tell me when Pelagius lived.
Yeah.
The Roman influence in Great Britain was very huge. And they were there for almost double the time of our country, the country's existence. So if you think about that, when the Romans eventually pull out of Great Britain...
360, 14 AD.
Yeah, so he could definitely had Roman parents. Because it's no different than, we think about how Americans, we station people all over the world. You might grow, how many people I grew up with, I have friends, I was born in Germany, but they're American. Well, they grew up, their father or their mother was in the Air Force or in the Army, right? The Romans did the same thing. So, even the Emperor Trajan, who is from Spain, he's still a Roman. He was living in Spain, right? They lived all over the place. And that's how they helped govern their numerous provinces. So Pelagius lived in a time where, did it say anything about his parents?
No, but it said that he apparently was Jerome apparently thought that Pelagius was actually Irish, suggesting that he was stuffed with Irish porridge. He was tall in stature and portly in appearance. Highly educated, spoke and wrote Latin and Greek with great fluency, and was well versed in theology.
So he was Irish.
Well, no, he was, but somebody can accuse him of being Irish. But
he was accused of being Irish. Oh, okay. All right. So...
Actual name was O. Pelagius.
O. Pelagius, that's right. All right, so it is called Pelagianism because it was first formulated by a British monk named Pelagius, against whom Augustine first formulated the doctrine of predestination in the 5th century. We will discuss two versions of it. So, although Protestants consider this to be a Catholic heresy, it is unknown among Protestants. It is not unknown amongst Protestants themselves. It crops up every time a Presbyterian says, God helps those who help themselves, instead of God helps those who cannot help themselves. It's interesting, where does that saying God helps those who help themselves come from? I'll give you a hint.
Richard's Almanac?
Yes. It does not come from the Bible. And good for Mr. Franklin. Ben Franklin's quotes often get tagged on being from the Bible. Yeah. So, Ben stuff, it must have been pretty heavy that people say, hey, that's biblical. No, it's Ben Franklin.
Right.
And I know Ben Franklin's somewhere smiling saying, once again, I think my stuff comes from the Bible. So again, right, so it crops up every time a Presbyterian says God helps those who help themselves. Actually, my grandfather said that all the time. Instead of God helps those who cannot help themselves. It crops up more subtly in many ethical debates in Protestant churches today. God will love, help, and save you, your family, your church, and your society if you have the correct liberal or conservative position on abortion, homosexuality, capital punishment, the role of women in church and society, capitalism and socialism, social welfare, or individual initiative. Self-salvation by good works, or at least right thinking, is a common heresy of Catholics and Protestants, right? So what Guthrie is saying, Pelagianism crops up not so much, or it can crop up in theological issues, but it also can crop up in social issues,
Yeah.
right? And we see this within our denomination, and I'm sure as we sit here and nod our heads, and sometimes we laugh, sometimes we grimace, every denomination deals with this.
But just to be a thorn in the side or whatever,
Yes.
wouldn't the parable of the talents kind of lend credence to that? It's all about what they do with what they're given.
Or is that an issue about faith?
Just throwing things out there.
I love it. Yes, yes, yes. And this is the reason why Martin Luther had such a big problem with the Epistle of James,
Yeah.
because James is all about works, all
Right.
about works.
Well, you can say, is it about salvation versus not being saved, or are there different levels of salvation?
That's true too. Yeah.
Or are we talking about salvation, and we're not talking about salvation like James is not talking about salvation. James is talking about this is how you should live. Because we are justified,
Right.
we should do, right? This is kind of like, these are the fruits of
Yeah.
what we've been
In
given.
other words, he's saying, it's not what you say, it's what you do. that
Yeah.
Proves that you
Right,
have faith.
exactly,
Right.
exactly. So yes, so of course Martin Luther, who we could say had tunnel vision in some aspects, that Martin said, because he was all about faith, salvation by faith alone. That when you read James, James is talking. It's all about works. James, to me, James is like this. It's a social justice. It's a get to work. It's a do. James would be the one, going to the shelters. James would be the one at the food pantries. James would be the one doing and saying this is what we should be doing, right? So I think Martin I think because of his tunnel vision, he kind of misses the point about what James is trying to talk about. James is not saying that you are saved by your works. James is saying because you are saved, get to work, right? So anyway, so yes, and it's this right thinking. You either think like us or you're out, right? Then we become gatekeepers, right? We become, you either think the way we think or you're gone. And, and then we turn the church into a country club, right? Where we vote on who's in and who's out. And unfortunately, people get the image that the ancient church was this homogeneous group of people, men and women, who all thought the same and who all behaved. There were no issues. And I send those people to read Corinthians. To say, if you think the ancient church was any better than the postmodern church, you need to take a look at Paul's works one more time, and maybe that'll change your position. Because it wasn't. I mean, my God. I wonder how many sleepless nights the church in Corinth gave Paul. If Paul had milk of Malanta, would he be drinking that? Of reading these letters that come to him over and over and over again. And not only that, in the 500s, the bishop, I think it was the Bishop of Rome, we have correspondence between him and Corinth. And it's some of the same issues. And you're talking about maybe 440 years later. So, habits die hard, I guess. They're passed down from, the sins of the father, I guess. Continue and continue and continue. So the church was never a group that was all on the same page. Never. Why? Because people are people. And people come from all walks of life, right? Paul talks about the strong and the weak, right? The strong being the people who go down to the market, and these are both Christians. The strong go down to the market, to the agora, see a wonderful cut of lamb, a leg of lamb. Oh, I'm going to take this. This is make a great dinner tonight. Oh, but this piece of meat was worshipped, was sacrificed to a local pagan god. Well, what do I care? That god doesn't exist. It's just a piece of stone. And take the lamb home, cook it up. Now, the weak would be the ones who say, oh, you can't do that. And so what you see is this dichotomy. It's human nature, right? And so Paul is trying to say, okay, the strong, I get you can do that. The weak, you must be careful around the weak. They have an issue with this. So don't strong arm them on this. Don't steamroll them on this. We must, you must be considerate of your sisters and your brothers, right? So these issues were there, just like they're here today, right? We fight over theological issues and we fight over social issues, just like they did. The issue might change, but it's still the same thing. Right? The hot topic issue or the issue of the day might change, but the reaction is the same. Oh, these people are going to go to hell because they don't believe what we believe. And so you read that, and it's the same thing. It's almost like, Groundhog Day, with Bill Murray. It's just the scene keeps playing over and over again, but it might be a different issue. It's something different, right? It's integration. It's women's rights. It's slavery, right? It's sexual orientation. It's abortion. It's stem cell research. I mean, we can go on and on. I mean, it's these social issues that continue, and then it's also the theological issues. But it's interesting today. The where the church splits hairs today, for the most part, are over social issues. You go back in time a few hundred years, it's theological issues. Right? And an interesting trivial piece. The first major denomination that was established within this country that was established over social issues was the AME Church in this country. Right? And so, but they were well before their time, but it was a necessary thing for that congregation, right? It was over social issues. Freed slaves, right? So, and now the rest of the churches are catching up to that, right? It's over social issues. All right. So we're talking about Pelagianism. All right, so it's important to emphasize that both Reformation Protestantism and Roman Catholicism reject this form of Pelagianism. Both know that it understands neither the depth of human sinfulness that makes us unable to earn God's love, nor the depth of God's love that saves us despite our sinfulness. On the one hand, it does not see the way we carefully select laws and commandments of God we can and want to obey, and ignore those we cannot or do not want to obey. It does not see that even when we do obey some of God's laws, we often do so not because we love God and neighbor, but because we love only ourselves. Right? And this is, we fall into that trap of creating God in our image and not vice versa, right? Because we want to congratulate ourselves and be congratulated and rewarded by God and by others for being such morally, spiritually, and ideologically superior and correct people. It does not see how our very goodness is sinful. On the other hand, extreme Pelagians do not really believe in the grace of God. God's grace is not given to good people who merit God's approval, but to sinners who do not care and do not merit it. It is grace that does not reward people for the good that they have done, but enables them to do the good they cannot do. It is grace that promises salvation, not as a payment for credit earned, but freely given gift. All right. So when you look at Pelagianism at its essence, Guthrie claims that it is rejected by Roman Catholics and Reformation Protestants. Now, we can say, well, that's the end of that, but it's not. Because there's another piece that he talks about, and we're going to get to that in 1 second. So this would be extreme or pure Pelagianism. We save or damn ourselves by the good works we do or refuse to do, right? And this is a very, I don't want to say it's taken by the secular community, but when you think about pop culture, when you think about movies, when you think about even cartoon, and I'm talking about old cartoons, right? We think about how this works and how it plays out, right? You think about Tom who's chasing Jerry, beating him with the skillet, right? And then he has a chance to get Jerry, and then a little angel pops up on one shoulder and says, "But Tom, you can't do that. You know, that's a bad thing to do, Tom. If you beat Jerry with the skillet, you're not going to go to heaven." And then on the other side, a little imp pops up and says, "Oh, just mash that mouse with a skillet. Don't worry about it." You know, and you get these ideas, right? And it's this: can Tom do enough good things to avoid having the elevator disappear and him landing inside some cauldron where a big dog is sticking him in with a pitchfork into the boiling oil, right? So we laugh about these things theologically, but these ideas have permeated our culture. So when we think about, you know, what it takes, well, there are some who believe, well, it's all about good and bad, that there's going to be this scale that weighs out the good and the bad. So it's more than an old Roman Catholic heresy we struggle with, trust me, is that it is more, it affects all of Christianity. Now, we think of Pelagianism, and it does, and it's no different than we think of the, I call it the new flavor, it's the prosperity gospel, and how this permeates all boundaries. And it's not just something that Protestant churches constantly, you know, I feel like, you know, I'm barricading the door, you know, keeping out the barbarians. But it permeates the Roman Catholic churches as well, and the other Catholic churches and the Orthodox churches. It's the concept of, if you just pray enough, if you're devout enough, you will be blessed with health, wealth, riches, whatever you want, right? And we see it. Just turn on any channel where you can watch some, and not all televangelists. I mean, some of them are just churches that have their, you know, shows televised. But you can see, you can sense the prosperity gospel. And I hope that every minister and every group of elders and deacons fight with their last breath to keep that out of the church. It is so destructive. It is so destructive. Theologically, socially, and just human. It's wrong, you know, to say that. You know, again, when you hear someone say, and a lot of times it's spoken, but it's not spoken with malice. You know, like, you meet someone whose kid was in a car accident, bad car accident, and that kid lived, and people say, well, it's only because you people prayed that my child is alive today. And then you meet people, and I've met a couple, whose daughter was in a bad car accident, and she eventually died. And don't you think people prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed for that child? Well, of course, you know, they did, but the response is different, right? So when you think about these things, we must be so careful in how we deal with people, because no situation is the same, and it's not all candy and flowers. You know, sometimes things turn out the way we don't want them to turn out. So when we think about some of these ways to look, Pelagianism, and there are other things that kind of seep into the church. You know, we deal with issues continually that will help break down the fabric of solid theology. And this is why we study theology, right? It's not so, you know, that ministers can be bored to death in seminary classes, and then ministers will then bore to death his members or his or her members in the church. It's so you are able now to build and understand your skeleton, the skeleton of what your theology is based on, so that when something comes at you, you can say, you know what, I don't know if that fits. I don't know if that makes sense. You know, and I'm not telling you to, you know, burn people at stakes, but what I'm saying is...
Now you tell me.
that you know enough to say, I don't think so. That doesn't fit. That doesn't make sense. So, now, straight up Pelagianism, right? Concentrated Pelagianism that you just add a little bit of water to and whammo, it's there, is rejected by most Roman Catholics and Protestants. But there is a watered down version that's a little bit more palatable, and that is called what? Semi-Pelagianism. Why invent a new word? I mean, there's no sense to reinvent the wheel, right? So semi-Pelagianism. And now this one's a little bit more tricky. And I'm going to go ahead and read semi-Pelagianism. But there is a moderate form of Pelagianism that seeks to preserve a more biblical understanding of our sin and God's grace. It is this semi-Pelagianism that became the official doctrine of Roman Catholicism. Although Luther and Calvin and the churches of the Reformation rejected Pelagianism, even in this moderate form, it has cropped up again and again in all branches of Protestantism and is still a popular, perhaps the most popular position with many Protestants today, including many who consider themselves Presbyterian or Reformed Christians. In theology class, my professors, they would ask us questions, and then they would point out which one of us were semi-Pelagians, and then threaten to burn us at stakes. Theoretically, of course. They'd have no one to send that graduates. Simply put, this is the semi-Pelagian position. We are all unworthy, undeserving sinners. We not only leave undone many things we ought have done, even the good we do is corrupted by sinful motives, desires, and goals. We are totally dependent on the saving grace of God in Jesus Christ for our salvation. So far, okay. Yeah, sounds solid, right? But, there's that but, right? That moves things in a different direction. But although it is true that we are not free and able to save ourselves by our good works, we are free and able to do one thing. We can acknowledge our need for God's grace and turn to God to ask for the deep, abiding faith, hope, and love we cannot achieve for ourselves. We can confess Christ as Lord and Savior and show our willingness to receive the salvation made available to us in Him. We can allow the transforming power, and of course these words, receive, allow, these are all italicized. We can allow the transforming power of God's Holy Spirit to come into our hearts. We can go to church in order to express our desire for the help and salvation we know and comes only from God. We cannot save ourselves, but we can do that much if we really want to. And if we choose God and turn to God in this way, God will then choose us, love, help, and save us. If some do not receive this saving grace, it is not because God has rejected them, it is because they have rejected God. Salvation is by God's grace alone, available to all who sincerely ask for it and want it. It is easy to see why this semi-Pelagian position is so popular with both Catholics and Protestants. It seems to preserve what is right with both double predestination and universalism, but to avoid the weakness of each. All right. Now, semi-Pelagianism, can you see how it's a lot more subtle? The rough edges are sanded off, right? It's smooth. It's easier. It's more palatable. I think it's more palatable. What then, working with our own theological frame as Reformed Christians, what does Calvin have a problem with?
That we don't choose.
That we don't choose. Exactly. It's not our choice, right? And I always use the expression, dead men don't walk, except in zombie movies. Right? Dead men don't walk. And so we do not have the ability, Calvin would say, to even reach out to God. It's not within us. That God chooses, and God is the one to reach to us. Now remember, in the beginnings of our study, we talk, and I'm talking about the beginnings of the book, not today, that when we talked about this, that Guthrie said that Calvin was staunch. No, God does everything. But remember, he said, but even theologians like Bart and Guthrie are more on the softer side, that there is this possibility that God is the one who reaches, but yet we might be able to say, okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so in this, when we think of semi-Pelagianism, it's the idea that God still does all the saving. God does everything. But we are the ones that have the choice to accept. We are the ones that make that movement toward God, not God toward us. Right? And this is what semi-Pelagianism teaches. So,
But then you can say, but it's a gift that we actually move forward,
Yeah. Which came first, the chicken
Yeah,
or the
yeah.
egg? Did
Yeah.
God choose us first, or
Because
did
if
we
we
choose Him
actually,
first?
I love the term irresistible grace.
that's right. We
Because
can't refuse
is-
it.
You can't.
You
We
cannot refuse it.
resist
That's right. We cannot refuse the grace. That's right.
I just need one more thing, one more, I just need one.
Yeah, so right, and that's what irresistible, and what Alejandra is talking about, there's a cute little, how are they called, acronyms?
Tulip?
TULIP, yeah,
Yep.
right? Does anyone know, and these are
I've heard that.
the 5 main points of Calvinism, right? TULIP, the T is
Total depravity.
total depravity. U,
We had memorized it. So.
Yeah.
did, isn't unlimited atonement?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, limited atonement is the
And
L.
these are-
That's the L.
The U, God, it's been a long time.
Yeah.
Irresistible grace, and P is the perseverance of the saints. I can't, what is U? Why can't I remember U?
Okay, in a second.
I
Don't,
definitely practiced total depravity in my early 20s.
Total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace.
okay, unconditional election.
The unconditional election.
Got it, okay.
Limited atonement, irresistible grace, perseverance.
Perseverance of the saints. So when Alejandro talks about irresistible grace and what that piece says, you can, if God comes a calling, you can't resist.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
we are, that you're programmed.
Like Paul.
Paul is the
Paul,
ultimate
Yeah,
example
yeah,
of
Paul is a
Right.
Paul is a perfect example of that, right? Here is Paul. He is dead set on thinning the herd, getting rid of these leaders of the Christian movement, and God said, "Zap, you're going to work for me now," and he can't resist, right? And so that's the thing. We think about that, and we think about irresistible grace. We think about how God has worked even within the Hebrew Scriptures, with the prophets. Think about Jonah. I mean, this man, he honestly tried
You're going
not
to
to do it.
Nineveh.
I mean,
You want to or not.
God literally chased him around the Mediterranean world. I mean, it just, he just ran, and finally gives up.
Yeah.
But he doesn't go down without a fight. And you got to give Jonah that credit. I mean, and the book ends in a fight. I mean, it's just, you don't even know how it ends. It ends with God and Jonah screaming at each other. No other book in the Bible has that. It ends with a question. No other book in the Bible has that either. Right? Who are you, Jonah? Can you do this? And we don't know. We don't know if Jonah says, "Phooey, I'm out." We have no idea what even happens. That's how it ends. It's a great ending. But it's a great example of, you can run all you want. I don't have to run anywhere. I just wait for you to stop running. I'm here. Right?
Well, it's like people that always say when you're called to ministry,
You just, right.
you run and you can run your whole life, but you know that
It's there. It's there. It might go away. It comes back. When you talk to people. And I think that's true for every calling. I think people are called to do certain things in life. People are called to, to work, to be a social worker. right? To be a doctor, to be a teacher. You know, I think people who are called to do something in life, you know, I think callings are strong, you know. And yes, you can move away from them, but it doesn't mean that calling won't always be there. You know, again, we're not marionettes, and that's not what, you know, Presbyterianism is not fatalism. It's not, we're all destined to do this no matter what you think, you're going to end up here. But I think that if we're called to do something and you decide to do something else, that calling will always be there. You know, it's up to us to make that decision. So we'll pick up next week and we'll dive into semi-Pelagianism a little bit more. But we can see why Guthrie says after it got a little polished, it was accepted by millions. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.